this month for our webinar. This month we're going to talk about ergonomic risk assessment. So my name is Sarah Snable. I'm a registered KIN and a certified professional ergonomist and one of the partners of PROergonomics, and I'm going to be the one doing the presentation today, talking about ergonomic risk assessment. So this is kind of a spin off of last month. Last month we talked a lot about hazard identification, so looking at the hazards that ergonomists are looking at, when we're talking about ergonomics, looking at the hazards that are contributing to musculoskeletal disorders, or MSDs. And so this month, even if you didn't attend last month, that's okay. What we're talking about now is how do you actually do those risk assessments? What are some things that you should look for? If you're going to be doing them yourself, what are some of the tools that you might be using? How would you actually be conducting it? As well as knowing when you need to go a little bit more complex and when you may be looking for some resources or calling in the help. So to give you guys a little bit of a background information, because I know we have quite a few people logged in today. So PROergonomics, we are all registered kinesiologists and certified ergonomists, or working towards the certified ergonomist designation. And our job is to go around and help different companies with their ergonomics programs. So we've been in a whole ton of different industries, from municipality to industrial and manufacturing, school boards, healthcare, office environments, the whole gamut kind of over the years. And really our job and the way that we work as a company is that we really promote a team approach. So, you often work with one consultant who kind of is the most experienced, in that industry, in your field, but also we really work as a team approach. We're all about education and learning. So we're always trying to educate others, in the sense of these free monthly webinars, trying to educate you on ergonomics, helps the profession, helps the industry of ergonomics, but also helping to kind of build that education in ourselves. So we're always sharing projects, information, and making sure that our customers and our clients are getting the best deliverables and the most efficient service when it comes to ergonomics. So really helping to kind of work with you guys to get the most innovative or cost-effective solutions. So jumping back to today's webinar, this is one of the key things that we do as ergonomists is these ergonomic risk assessments. There are, lots of things that we do as ergonomists. I might do something kind of more on the simple side in terms of setting up a computer workstation, but as we get more in depth, I'm definitely the ergonomic risk assessment, being able to look at a job objectively, identify the hazards, try to quantify the risks, and come up with some action items. That is kind of the detailed work that we do, and some of the more exciting work that we do, really, because it's when you really get to use your problem-solving hat and your creativity, and you get to watch a lot of jobs that you may not have seen. So you get to do a lot of thinking outside the box and see a lot of things that you may not have otherwise gotten to see. In terms of what we're going to talk about today is it kind of will be a bit of a flow. The bulk really is talking about the risk assessments, but I want to start with just highlighting some of the resources that you'll have available to you when doing risk assessments, so some of those documents and guidelines that are out there. Do a quick little recap on identifying the hazards to make sure that we're all on the same page. And then we will spend most of this webinar talking about the actual assessment and kind of, how to go into that in-depth or when to go into an in-depth risk assessment. And then touch on, the important part of your assessment is also evaluating it, right? So after you kind of go assess, implement a control, you want to evaluate and make sure that it's actually working. So number 3 is where we're going to spend the bulk of the time today, but just to kind of give you an idea of the flow. So in terms of resources that you have available to you, Ontario's MSD prevention guidelines are a great resource. This is a 5-book series, and I'm noticing how blurry my pictures are in this. I'm going to have to change that. The middle one's super clear. So the MSD prevention guidelines, we have these actually as a link. They're free. It's downloadable. You'll find them in a lot of different places, but you can check out our website under the resources tab, and there is a 5-book series here. So the first 2 books, part 1 and part 2, are really resource manuals, and they're talking a lot about how to implement a program. So if you're trying to prevent MSDs in your workplace, in putting into place an MSD prevention program, putting in place an ergonomics program, whatever it is that you're calling it, part 1 and part 2 are going to kind of give you that overview, give you the foundation, help explain the structure and the importance. It's the background, right? Then part 3, and those that's a 3-book part, so it's sorry, I didn't word that very well, but it's part 3A, 3B, 3C. So it's 3 books, all part of part 3. And these are called the toolbox. And this is where you'll find a lot of checklists. You'll find the actual like sample documents, examples of risk assessment tools or guidelines that you can use. So they get a little bit more complex. I mean, definitely, if you are kind of new to this, I would start with part 1 and part 2, and then, you know, that's where it's going to give you some basic hazard identification. And when you're looking to get a little bit more advanced, you're looking for a more variety of tools, then 3A, 3B, and 3C are going to be good references for you as well. So again, those are downloadable. I mean, you can find them via Google search or check out our website under the resources page, and you'll find them there to download as well. So pulling from kind of the process and how you would do this. So, I mean, ideally, you've got some kind of a process in place at your workplace in terms of how you're identifying hazards, whether they be safety hazards or MSD hazards, right? Part of your safety and ergonomics program is that ideally you're identifying the hazards, then assessing them, and then implementing a control, and then reviewing and evaluate, and then, you know, kind of redoing it. Part of your review and evaluate is redoing. So it's, you know, a very common process, this kind of a diagram, this flow chart. So basically, I mean, I've got the example here is identifying a manual handling hazard, but this is anything, identifying your MSD hazard, identifying your slip, trip, fall hazard. You know, this is a similar process. So basically, you're identifying the hazard. You're looking at, you know, incident records. You're looking at employee feedback. You are observing the job to identify those hazards. Do you see a hazard? Yes. Okay, you're going to assess it. No, you don't see a hazard? Well, okay, we're just going to monitor it. We don't need to go any further. Right? So when you're going to assess the hazard, you know, in this case, it's asking, did the risk exceed guidelines? And what I'm going to talk about today is that we don't always need to talk about whether or not the risk exceeds the guidelines, right? We don't always need to have this number or this kind of a measurement to say, to really confirm whether or not we need to make a change, right? It doesn't have to always be compared. We can do things like a simple risk assessment. You know, if you have a job where they're doing, you know, a pretty heavy lift, maybe they're lifting a 60-pound bag of product, you know, we don't need to know that the safe lifting guideline is 45 pounds, or, you know, I'm pulling a number arbitrarily out here. You know, if people are getting injured or people are complaining or the lift looks awkward at 60 pounds, then we know that that's a problem and we need to make change. You know, knowing the guideline can then help in terms of, well, what do we need to lower it to, right? If you want to really kind of get into the nitpicky, but we don't always need to have that guideline. And so in terms of assessing it, you're looking at all the contributing factors and then coming up with a plan on what you're going to do about it. So this is the whole flow. So last month we talked about identifying MSD hazards, and that was really, we spent a lot of time focusing on number 1. And so today we are going to focus on assessing the hazard, which is kind of part 2 in this flow or process. And so there may be different goals or reasons, these different motivating factors behind, you know, why you're doing or why you're addressing ergonomics in your workplace. I mean, hopefully you're all addressing ergonomics in your workplace, and maybe you're here today because you know the importance and you know about how the injury prevention, the cost savings, how it increases productivity, all of these things. But when you're trying to really get buy-in from up above to be able to have extra time or resources potentially to spend on this, then here are some kind of words or reasons or things that you might be able to use to kind of help justify that. So one of the obvious things is removing hazards. So if I do an assessment and I implement a change, I implement a lift assist, I implement a new way of doing something, I change the flow of the workstation or the layout or the design, I change the height of something, I'm removing the hazard. I'm being very proactive. So being proactive is the word you're using. That, you know, if we do these assessments, if we implement this, we're being proactive. We are preventing an injury before it even happens because we have actually removed or eliminated the hazard. If you are saying that one of your justifications is to decrease injuries, that's a bit more of a retroactive approach. Totally still fine, right? But if you've had an injury and now that's why you're doing assessments, you are being a bit more reactive or retroactive. Still needs to be done, but, and you know, you can have this long list of reasons why you're going about this program, this assessment process. And really, removing the hazards is preventing an injury, or if you've had an injury and now you're doing some changes, then you're decreasing injuries, both beneficial. And improving efficiencies. So this is something that, you know, we often don't always make the initial connection to ergonomics, but it can make you more productive. If we think about movements, we talk about awkward postures, reaching to the part on the assembly line, reaching to the tool. That's essentially a wasted movement. It's a waste of time, really. If I have to do extra reaching, or if I'm double handling a product, I could actually, if I can adjust the layout, if I can change the height of something so that you're not having to reach as far, if you're not having to double or triple handle a product, then I am improving efficiencies. And, you know, for a manufacturing company, for example, this is, you know, time is money. The faster you can do something, the more products you can make, the more money we make at the end of the day. So ergonomics can also help with improving efficiencies, especially if we're thinking about, you know, the wasted movements that can happen. Right? If I talk about trying to improve postures, I'm trying to improve wasted or unnecessary movements. You could use it as a reason to justify that you're an innovator, that you're leading in your field. You know, we are really looking out for our employees. This is a great place to work because we are doing assessments on everybody's computer workstation before, like as soon as they get here. You know, we're always trying to make sure that we've got like the latest technology or tools, make sure that we are really doing the best for our workers. So it could be a reason for that, to be a leader in your field. Again, the more that you're integrating across different departments, so for yourself, it depends on, you know, we've got a bunch of people from different backgrounds, different roles really in your organization on today. And some of you may be the ones who are going to be doing this assessment, you know, because maybe you're relatively small, you wear many hats. You're the one that's going to be doing it all, or maybe you're here to bring some information back to your team or committee. And really, the more that you can integrate, you know, if you're just trying to do the assessment, you know, you want to get other people on board in your organization as well, like the engineering department or maintenance. So that way then they're doing kind of the risk assessment process or understanding the ergonomics when they're doing the design process, for example. So designing out those changes right from the get-go, designing out those hazards. Maybe it's also working with purchasing, for example. So they're the ones that are actually purchasing or buying the equipment. They're the ones that are, you know, evaluating the different offers or bids that have come in. And so you need to have them on board in terms of the features, the specs, you know, so that we don't forget or neglect ergonomics in that process. So there's many different departments that you would want to get on board with this. And then as well, any kind of risk assessment process, your program, your hazard identification, all of that. I mean, you want to make it systematic and easy to use. If it's really complicated, excuse me, if it's really complicated, it's not going to be sustainable. People aren't going to use it. You know, you're going to end up doing a lot of work yourself, really. If you're the one that knows how to use it and nobody else does, it's going to be a lot of work on your shoulders. So in terms of, you know, reasoning, justifications, motivators, I just wanted to throw out some different words in terms of how you might use this to kind of justify doing more ergonomic risk assessments in your company. And obviously there are some challenges. Oh, excuse me, I've got a, there we go. Sorry, I had a little sound blip there. So in terms of some of the challenges in this too is that, you know, we want to make sure that we're addressing this. This is going to be part of you getting your buy-in, because you're going to do risk assessments and you're going to have some recommendations for change, right? But you're going to need buy-in from the people who are kind of holding the money, who's going to help support those changes that you're about to recommend. And sometimes it can be difficult because in terms of MSDs, They may be a high frequency, and they often are. We know that they're one of the leading causes of injuries in Ontario workplaces, but they're a relatively low severity, especially when you're comparing them to other safety hazards. So, you might have an electrician, for example, and the safety hazard is, they can be electrocuted, or you've got workers who, you're really focusing on some of the cut hazards because of the knives that they're handling. Those are much higher severity in some of those safety injuries. But a shoulder injury isn't necessarily going to cause death, for example, right? If I'm kind of looking at the extremes here. So sometimes it can be challenging to get that buy-in because of the fact that, it's not necessarily going to cause like a life or death situation here. Yes, they can be quite debilitating, but that's the reality, is that you've got a back strain, a wrist strain, elbow tendonitis kind of going up against, in many cases, an injury like being electrocuted, like being cut, like falling off of the roof, for example. And also we're trying to, from the higher up, from your management, they're wanting like a business case, for example. How much money is this going to save us? And you're trying to say, well, it's going to prevent a potential injury. Now, if you've had an injury, if you've been unfortunate, you've had an injury and you've been able to kind of pull some of those dollar costs, then that is definitely helpful in terms of building your business case. But for a lot of you, when you're trying to be more proactive and prevent an injury, you are trying to guess, really, what this potential injury could cost you. And that the cost will vary depending on the severity. You could have a relatively minor or mild injury that costs a couple $1,000s, and it could be a much more debilitating back injury that is costing you upwards of $50,000, for example, once you kind of factor in all of those costs. So absolutely, it can be kind of tricky to pull some of those numbers because you are, you're trying to be proactive is your goal. And sometimes, again, you can think of that there are different perceptions of whether the injury is real or if it's exaggerated, or and that can come down to perception. So you might have somebody, a small female, for example, who's been working on the line for years and years and years, no problems, no injuries, and then a new worker comes on, and let's say he's like a relatively large male, definitely taller and larger than this kind of small female who's been doing the job no problems, and after like 7-8 months, this new worker, the large male, is now experiencing an injury, an MSD injury, and claiming that. And, for some people, that perception can be kind of hard to grasp, that it's like, well, how could he be having a problem, right? Like, this small little lady's been doing it for so long and she has no problem. So there can be a perception that the injury may be exaggerated or not, I don't want to say like not real, but do you know what I mean? Like that it could be exaggerated, and it's hard for everybody to realize that every body is a little bit different, and we're all going to react a little bit different. It's not just about the fact that just because a small person can do it, that everybody else should be able to do it. So sometimes there can be some perceptions of how an MSD occurs, and just because somebody's been doing the job forever and ever and ever, and the new person gets hurt, it doesn't mean that the new person is lying or making it up or faking. We do need to make sure that we're kind of ruling out those perceptions and trying to explain, how MSDs occur. Another barrier potentially can be this perceived cost of change. Oh, well, I don't want to do this assessment. I don't want to implement this change because it's going to cost us so much money. And in reality, there are lots of controls or changes that we make that are related to ergonomics that really are not very expensive. I mean, there are definitely times, we may recommend that, your gold standard or your ideal is to automate a process. And yes, that could be several $1,000s. It could be, much more than that, really, if you're talking about automation or implementing a robot. But it could be something like a lift assist, again, a lift assist, a rotating pallet, a height adjustable pallet. Those kinds of things can be a little bit more expensive, or, even redesigning a workstation, right? If you're going to have to do some construction, maybe the line has to go down, those kinds of things. Those would be the examples of some really high costs, but there's lots of lots of other controls that are kind of considered like the low-hanging fruit, and they're not usually very expensive. Like a new tool, could be cost you like $50, and the return on investment would be huge. So there's there's not often as big of an expense when it comes to implementing change as some people might think. Ergonomics isn't about costing a whole lot of money, and there's a lot of research out there that is kind of showing that when it comes to ergonomics and implementing controls, that the return on investment is actually quite short. So you might spend $15,000 on this lift assist and some new equipment that kind of to fix this process or address the issue on the line, right? To remove people are lifting that 60-pound bag of product, and now we're going to use a lift assist. It might have cost us a bunch of money up front, but if you were a company that was seeing, whether it be just complaints or actual injuries, maybe 1 or 2 a year, that lift assist has paid for itself in much less than a year, possibly even 6 months. So the return on investment can actually be quite short. So let's talk more about actually doing the risk assessment and talking about some possible controls as well. So what I'm going to start with is just doing this reminder really about what are the MSD hazards. So when we're doing this risk assessment, I'm kind of assuming that you have already identified the hazards. So you are, and maybe it's part of your risk assessment actually, maybe you're doing it all at once. But really what you're out there is you're observing the job, you're looking at reporting, you're looking at the different data that's coming in to identify the hazards of the job. So that could be forceful exertions like lifting, pushing and pulling, elements where you're seeing like hand gripping forces, for example. You're wanting to identify those, maybe take some measurements. You're looking for awkward postures. So everything from bending, twisting, crouching, kneeling, looking at the neck, the back, the shoulder, the wrist. You're trying to identify where those problem areas are. You're looking for static postures. So times when people aren't moving or holding a posture for a long time. So it could be sitting, for example, or standing and not moving, but it could also be holding a tool or a part for a long period of time. So static postures can be kind of the whole body, and they could be of one body part in particular, right? Holding your arm at shoulder height while you screw in the part to the assembly, right? Like it could be the whole body sitting, and it could be just one body part. As well as looking at repetition, so in terms of how often they're doing something, if they're doing it over and over again, how often are they doing it. Part of your hazard identification is kind of checking off, yep, it's present, yep, it's present, nope, it's not present. And then, and part of that also should be documenting a little bit about, where you're seeing that, maybe writing down some numbers and measurements, maybe even taking some pictures to go along with that. And really, maybe part of your checklist, like let's say your Joint Health and Safety Committee is going around and doing hazard inspections. So they're doing their safety inspections and looking at MSD hazards as part of that checklist. They may be just kind of commenting on, yes, it's present, and making some short little notes. And that would be the precursor or the basis when you're doing your risk assessment. So you've got a start on some of the hazards that are identified. And your next step is going to be going out and kind of looking at those in more detail. And if they don't already have numbers, because part of your checklist is kind of going around just saying, things that you see, part of your initial assessment in your risk assessment will be kind of adding a bit more detail to your hazard identification. There's also some other things that you might be looking at as well, right? So these are kind of, I go back, the force, postures, and repetition. Those are the big three. Those are the ones that you're probably going to see at least one of those in most jobs. And then depending on your organization, there may be some others that you're also looking at. So vibration, whether it be driving a vehicle, a forklift, or holding a tool like a jackhammer, power tools, as well as the environment, so the temperature, if they're working in cold rooms, freezers, walk-in refrigerators, or if they're working in really hot environments, usually cold is, can make the muscles really tight, and muscles like heat, but then that can be a factor too. If you get too hot, it gets really tiring. Now we're at risk of heat stress. So commenting on the environment as well as contact stress. So anytime like a body part is rubbing up against a surface. So like, I'm sitting at my computer right now, and so in the example that first comes to my head is when your forearm is resting on the edge of the desk, right? That can be a contact stress. It's not a forceful contact stress, but over time, your forearm rubbing on that edge of the desk as you use your mouse, that would be considered a contact stress. Or similarly, working on repairs at a table or on a vehicle, contact stress potentially could be leaning against that table or leaning against the vehicle as you work under the hood. Those could be some contact stresses. And then work organization and work methods. So as part of your assessment or maybe your identification is that you're noticing that, I don't know if this is the best layout. I don't know if this is the best setup. It looks kind of awkward. So maybe it's not necessarily that the task is that you're not necessarily seeing like a heavy lift, for example, but maybe you're noticing that somebody, an employee, is maybe doing something that looks kind of awkward. You think that could be improved, right? Maybe they're double, triple handling something. Maybe worker A is doing it in a very different way than worker B, and you think that worker B's technique looks like it's more efficient, it doesn't look as awkward, and so that could be part of the hazard that you've identified, or the springboard really on what you want to look into a little more detail. So again, this is kind of regurgitating, reviewing some of those hazards that you are identifying. Usually you're trying to categorize these. I put these as headings usually, and then I'm trying to identify within that. So you may already have a checklist. If you attended last month and you requested our MSD checklist, I'm curious, how's it working for you? And if you don't have that and you'd like our MSD checklist, by all means, send me an email and I'm happy to send that out to you. If you don't already have one, of course, right? So, or if you want to compare ours to what you are using. So, it's headings, right? So these are the headings for the hazards that I'm looking for. And ideally, you are having this as a standardized process. So whatever your checklist is, whatever your process is, that you have it, that it's clear, that it's documented in writing in some way so that it doesn't matter who's doing the hazard identification, be it yourself or your Joint Health and Safety Committee or the supervisor, even the frontline workers in terms of how they report something, that everybody knows how the process works. So, excuse me, you might have your MSD checklist. It might be part of your Joint Health and Safety Committee inspections, and that's a standardized checklist. And so that's the same process you start with every time. You start with that checklist, you fill that out, and that way then everybody's clear on how the process works, as well as storing that information in like a centralized location so that anybody who needs to be able to look up that information knows where to find it, as opposed to having, stray papers at this station and in this office and in this filing cabinet, right? Like we want to have it. I guess that's probably one of the nicer parts about technology and computers is that you could have potentially one place really where you're storing all of this information. And really, when it comes to hazard identification, and this kind of comes back to the health and safety, your responsibilities under the Health and Safety Act too, is that assessments and that needs to be conducted by a competent person. And I know sometimes that can be, I don't know, I've had some interesting conversations about this competent person type of thing, but really it comes down to just, they need to know how to identify those hazards. And I talked a lot about that last month in terms of, how you might be able to, who does this? Who does it have to be? Does it have to be a specialist? Does it have to be an ergonomist that's coming around and identifying your MSD hazards and doing your risk assessments? And the answer is no. Definitely that is what I do, but I don't have to be the one that's doing that. By all means, it could be yourself. It could be your Joint Health and Safety Committee. It could be an ergonomics committee maybe you have. It could be your in-house staff. And all it takes is a little bit of training either by yourself or potentially another resource like us, for example, but that is training them on ergonomics. So getting them up to speed on what those MSD hazards are and ultimately training them on your process. So here's how we identify hazards, here's how we report them, here's how we do assessments, here's when we do assessments, and here's the process for, trying to make changes. So in terms of, who can be doing these assessments, there are lots of different people who could be involved. By no means does it have to be just yourself. If you're the health and safety coordinator or manager, it doesn't have to be just you that's going out and doing all of this. If you've got a team or if you've got other resources, definitely you should be thinking about who you could use. We definitely believe education is an important component of ergonomics, right? It's not a topic that is necessarily complicated, right? I'm looking at postures, I'm looking at forces, it can sound sort of easy, but it's not necessarily everybody's primary language. Yes, I talk ergonomics every day. So in my world, I think it's kind of easy. I'm super interested in it. But there are other people that maybe are not thinking about ergonomics right off the bat. And so a little bit of education on what is an MSD, what is ergonomics, how to identify the hazards, it can go a long way with them. And so your managers and supervisors, they may need something like MSD hazard identification, right? Knowing how to identify those hazards. They may not necessarily be the one who is doing the actual assessment. And so they just kind of need some of those basics. Your engineering groups, your maintenance groups, again, MSD hazard identification, kind of that foundation, the base, great for them, as well as maybe some more specialized training, because they're the ones who are going to be fixing things or designing things, maybe the ones that are actually implementing the changes. If you want to make a change to the height of your line or a table, then you're going to need them to do it, and they might need to have a little bit more in-depth knowledge in terms of what height and, we wanted at elbow height. Well, what does that mean? They want the numbers. And so a little bit more specialized training or customized would be good for that group. If you have an ergonomics team, or maybe it's your joint health and safety committee, either or, again, that base, that MSD hazard identification is great for them. And if you think this is the group that's going to be helping you potentially with conducting assessments, then having a little bit more of that specialized training in how to do the assessments and the tools that you're going to use, this is good for them as well, right? Having a little bit beyond the basics with them, because they're the ones that are going to be kind of doing those assessments and helping to make the changes, to take action. And then your frontline staff, they are not necessarily the ones conducting the assessments, but what's important for them is, again, being able to identify the hazards and then being able to report it. So they're needing to, you're often looking for feedback from them. It's not really going to be possible for you to know the hazards of every single job. You're not the one doing the job every day. And so it may look one way, but feel another way to the person doing the job. So, them being able to report, to know, what is a hazard, an MSD hazard, and knowing how to report it, feeling comfortable in reporting it, all that information is important in terms of training to get them on board, really, to help your assessment process. So in terms of, actually doing your assessment, there are some different tools out there, and different levels of complexity, and they range. So I kind of have broken them out into a couple different levels here, right? So level one is your kind of very basic, not very complex feedback in terms of risk assessment. So you may be looking at discomfort surveys. You could put out a survey and ask people where they're having discomfort, asking for their feedback. This is going to help you to kind of prioritize or to know where you might want to look further. So if you get a whole whack of surveys back and people are saying that they hate this one workstation in particular because whichever, then that's a really great place to start. You don't really need to do a whole lot of more in-depth risk assessment. You're not necessarily needing it to compare to guidelines. You want to fix the thing that everybody's complaining about. Also, kind of keeping on that simple level is checklists. That's like your MSD hazard checklist, for example. And maybe you have some of your own internal tools. You might have a risk matrix that you can also apply to MSD hazards. Those kinds of things are the more simple risk assessment tools that are probably going to do you just fine most of the time, right? Especially for what you're trying to tackle in-house. As you get more complex, we're talking about standards and guidelines like well, you know what, ergonomics isn't really legislated, right? There are standards and guidelines out there that we are trying to comply with, so we have some guidelines in terms of anthropometrics or design guidelines that are trying to maximize good posture, right? So designing things so that we're not doing a lot of bending or reaching overhead, based on measurements that we have for tall males, small females, in terms of what their shoulder heights are, right? So that's trying to ideally optimize postures. And we have some standards as well. There's CSA standards for office workstations, for example, and there is also guidelines for design. There are, you might have some ISO standards, for example, that may have some reference to ergonomics. And then we have some other tools, like, we have the Liberty Mutual tables for lifting. These are more complex tools that, honestly, most of the time, I don't think that you necessarily need in-house. And let's talk more about that. So really, if you are doing a risk assessment, I think that a simple risk assessment is probably where you can do a lot in-house, right? It's simply whether or not you have an agreement on the MSC hazards. So if you're yourself in a small group, your Joint Health and Safety Committee or your Ergo Committee, really, they are looking at the hazards. You're going out, you're doing a checklist, and are we agreeing on the hazards? Yes, we all agree that 80-pound lift is the problem. So let's address that. Let's move forward and address that. You don't necessarily need a professional or an ergonomist to come in and tell you that 80-pound lift is the problem. You know that. It's relatively obvious. And so that's where a simple risk assessment is just fine, right? Sometimes it can get a little bit more tricky when you're not really sure of the root cause, or you're not sure, maybe you've addressed one and you're kind of coming back and like, well, we're still having problems, and you might run your risk assessment, your simple risk assessment again, kind of like, okay, well, we fixed that lift, people are still having trouble with the shoulder. So now you're kind of going back and looking, okay, well, you know what, yeah, we took away that lift, but they're still reaching. So now we're going to go and we're going to address that reaching to the bin that is, 65 inches, right? So that's above shoulder height. And so a simple risk assessment tool is simply, looking at the job, looking at the task, identifying the hazards, and you're not necessarily having to quantify them or run them against some, crazy spreadsheet where you're calculating the tools and using all of this posture software. You just basically need to have an agreement, right? That we know that these are the hazards. But if you're not in agreement, or if you're really struggling in terms of what is the root cause, or if you really do need to know more of the level of risk because you're really having a hard time prioritizing, we've got 6 jobs that are everybody's complaining about them. Hopefully you don't have that, but we've got a whole bunch of jobs. There's lots of our basic hazard identification has identified that we've got a couple ones we need to look at, but really we need to be able to prioritize. You might want to go a little bit further to kind of put some numbers to those to be able to quantify. And so that would be an in-depth risk assessment. And it's still absolutely something that you can do in-house. You are probably just going to look up some more tools, or you're going to look up some guidelines to try to get you some numbers, again, to help you be able to quantify or prioritize. And in this case, let's, the training is going to come into play. You can probably have a lot more people doing the hazard identification, but when it comes to trying to look into more detail, you're going to need people to know where to find those resources to kind of help support, where you're pulling these numbers from, and why. And this is, I mean, absolutely, this is where an ergonomist would come into play as well, is doing a very in-depth assessment, but still something that you can do in-house, where you might be observing the task, and this is where you're collecting a lot more data. Right? You are taking measurements, you're weighing the product, you are weighing the part that they're lifting, you're taking measurements in terms of how high they're reaching, how far they're reaching, you're timing it to know the kind of the frequency. You're actually putting a lot more numbers to this, and then using those numbers to kind of compare against some other more established guidelines from the ergonomics field. So at this point too, this is part of, when you're setting up your process, is wanting to know what it is that you're going to do in-house. You know, how in-depth are you going to go in-house before you call in your resources, right? So having kind of all that documented that, you know, we're going to follow this checklist, we're going to do this and this is where we're going to go, but if we get stuck and at this point, this is when we know that we're going to call in some extra help. So in terms of when you're out there getting that extra data, I just wanted to kind of show like how we're really trying to evaluate that root cause and talk a little bit about how we would look at all of these elements, right? So ideally, you're out there observing the job and the task. Like, yes, collecting the feedback is great, but you need to be out there seeing it. And I think that makes sense. I don't think I need to spend much more time talking about that. And you want to think about and make sure you see all of the different products. If you're looking at an assembly line, if you're looking at, you know, you're out in the field watching somebody do an install, you want to know the different products that they're handling, because inevitably you'll be out there on the day when they're doing a product, doing an install, and they're like, oh, we hardly ever do this one, or, whoa, this is a light one, you should have been here on this other day. So making sure you know the kind of variety and the different products or items that they're handling, making sure that you see all of the tools and equipment, and this could include weighing the tools and equipment. I often, again, this is because I'm a consultant and I don't work in-house, is that I'm probably taking pictures of the equipment and I'm probably writing down the model name and number just so I can potentially look up some more information when I get back to my office. Really taking into play the environment, like kind of taking, you know, making sure that you're looking at the environment in terms of what's around them, what are some of the other factors that could be contributing, looking at how they do the task in terms of maybe they have something documented, maybe there is an SOP or some task steps that are outlined that tells them how to do it. And, you know, are we following that? Are those the best task steps? So kind of looking at some of that documentation that might be available as well. I always talk to the operator and I ask them questions, and ideally I like to see multiple people doing the job. It's really good to see, you know, somebody tall doing the job and somebody short doing the job to kind of understand their different challenges as well. You know, you could see somebody doing the job and they have no problems, and you could see somebody doing the job who has a ton of problems. And so you want to make sure that you're kind of factoring out some of that bias as well, kind of making sure that you do get a complementary amount of feedback from the different workers doing the job, because you wouldn't want to, you know, the person who has a ton of feedback for you or a ton of complaints, if you go and change things kind of based on their long laundry list, it may not necessarily be what everybody else agrees on. So it's really important to kind of look at the different people doing the job as well and get that feedback and the viewpoints from their perspective. So in terms of trying to evaluate that root cause, I'm also looking at the whole job, right? So here's kind of an example, you know, that I've got thrown out here. So an employee is they've hurt their back. They lift bags of product about 55 pounds from a skid, and they load the hopper. So in terms of, you know, what is the root cause and trying to figure out what caused this problem or how can we fix it, you know, really that's it. We've identified a hazard because, you know, somebody has hurt their back. We've identified that the product is 55 pounds. And now we're trying to do that risk assessment. So you're going to ask a lot of questions. You're going to ask a whole lot of whys. So why did they lift the bag from the floor on their own? Why was the skid on the floor? Why was there anybody else to help? Why are the bags ordered in 55 pound quantities? Why, you know, you might have, maybe you ask 2, 3, 4 why questions, and that helps you get to the root cause, right? You've identified the problem, and maybe you need to ask a few more whys to kind of dig a little bit deeper. And so the root cause really is, in this case, we know we've identified that the cause is really the weight of the bag, the storage height, like the floor level, reaching down that low is not really promoting good posture. We're bending over. We've also identified that the reach distance could be a problem. So they're reaching across the skid to grab this 55-pound bag and dragging it towards them. And maybe scheduling issues do not allow for help, or maybe it's just not, maybe they never have help because they're there on the job on their own, right? So these are the things that we're trying to get to know what we want to fix. right? So you need to ask the whys and really dig down to the root cause. Because sure, the 55-pound bag, maybe that's not necessarily something that we can change, but because remember, MST hazards in combination are really the problem. So force, yes, the 55 pounds is one factor, but the height, reaching down below and reaching across, we've combined some awkward postures in here. So now we've got a combination of MST hazards. Maybe I can't necessarily change the 55-pound bag, but I potentially could change the height that they're reaching to the bag and potentially the distance that they're reaching, right? Do they have the ability to walk around the skid instead of reaching? Is there enough space for that? Do they have space, or is it an option potentially to have a rotating pallet to place the skid or the pallet on a rotating stand? Even a fancy height adjustable rotating stand. That'd be pretty neat because we'd address the height and we'd address the reaching. Not always the most practical solution for every application, but just things to think about is that we may not necessarily be able to address the weight, but because we've identified some of these other risk factors, then there are multiple opportunities to make some change here. And so in terms of how you're going to document your risk assessment, I do think that it's important to document it. You want to have it in writing. So it may be something as simple as just adding on to your checklist. You have your MSD checklist, you're kind of going through identifying hazards and you're adding in your comments there. And maybe it's as simple as just elaborating on that, adding in your measurements. And maybe you need to have some kind of a one-page report that's saying, here's the hazard that I identified. I've got a picture here of an example. Maybe it's lifting or manual handling. And you're going to list your couple of examples here of what was the problem that you saw with the handling or with the lifting, right? So they're lifting bins to a hopper. They do it 3 to 4 times an hour. Here's the height that I measured them lifting from, and the actual weight of the bin is 40 to 45 pounds. Right? It kind of varies on how full that bin is. And maybe that's as far as you go for your kind of simple risk assessment, to know that, we want to change the height, right? You've got it documented that these are the hazards, and then maybe where I've got the columns risk and recommended limit, maybe you've got that instead as a column that's kind of coming up with recommendations or action items or proposed changes. And you could then say, you could list, as a committee, if you're working with a group or together yourself, with the supervisor, with some of the employees, kind of coming up with some ideas. Okay, well, we've identified that the weight is an issue. We've also identified that, reaching overhead is an issue. We've identified that they are carrying this up and down a ladder. And so what are some ways that we could improve this? And so, maybe your first thought is like, well, does it have to be 45 pounds? Could we do a smaller bin? Great, that's one idea. You kind of list your ideas here, and then together you kind of prioritize and weed through which do you think will have the biggest impact. And in that case, you don't need to have the guidelines. You don't need to use fancy risk assessment tools, or I say fancy, but I'm thinking some of those fancy software programs, for example. You don't necessarily need to have that, because you have all agreed that these are some of the hazards, and you've come up with some ideas on how you could improve the job. So keep it simple. Definitely you want to document it. You want to be able to document, what you saw and what your proposed changes are, so that you've got something to kind of go back to create an action item, to assign it, to be able to follow up, to know, and also to kind of do a comparison afterwards, right? So after you make changes, kind of go back to the beginning and compare to see if you actually did reduce the hazard, if you're seeing that improvement. Keep it simple, and again, keep it centralized, keep it somewhere where everybody knows where they can get that information. If you're not there the next day, you win the lottery, you take another position and you leave, knowing so that the next person knows where to get all that information, that's going to be important as well. In terms of some of your recommendations, I think that you want to keep it simple, but I have some words of caution kind of on both aspects here. So your recommendations for change, some of the more obvious ones that you think of, especially when you think of some of those more expensive ones, is, automating or getting lift assist, or, getting those height adjustable pallet stands that that tilt and rotate, but that doesn't always have to be the solution. That could be, that's what we would like to get to, but realistically, that's not going to fit into our budget for right now, maybe for next year, but not for right now. So you also want to make sure that you're addressing things that you can do right now. Can we encourage our workers to walk around the pallet? Maybe we can't get that rotating pallet in. Can we stack them a little higher? Can we stack so that we don't have to reach to the bottom shelf, right? Or we don't have to stack the skid on the floor, right? There might be some other changes that you can make for the short term as well. So part of your recommendations, should be looking at short and long term, but I want to caution you away from always looking at all of the big expensive, we'll call them engineering controls. And similarly, all of your controls shouldn't be administrative. So all of your controls or all of your ideas for change shouldn't be just like, oh, well, we'll train them to do it differently, or we'll rotate them through different stations, or we'll put in a stretching program and that's going to make everybody healthier and they're not going to get injured, right? If we just focus on administrative controls, we have definitely, that's a myth, right? They're potentially, it's not always just about educating people on how to do things differently. Sometimes another tool or changing a process is really what's needed. And, ideally, these are working hand in hand. So if you are implementing a new tool, if that's, one of your recommendations, or we're going to change how we do something, then yes, some training, some education should go along with it to make sure that people are doing it or using it in the way that's intended. Make sure they kind of get that buy-in. So there are lots of potential controls that could go into play, and depending on what job we're looking at, I could go into a whole lot more detail than what's on here. But again, my words of caution to you are really to just make sure that you're looking at a balance of those engineering and administrative controls, as well as trying to think of things that are short-term and long-term. So just because something seems complicated or seems expensive, still write it down, like brainstorm some ideas, but also think about some things that may be short-term or more practical that might work kind of for the now, and then work towards those gold standards or those ideal changes. And I've got a case study here just kind of to show you an example. So here's a company, and they do manual handling of tubs of chicken meat. Kind of a gross example, but this is what they do. They're manually loaded. So they do it by hand. They place them on the floor in stacks up to approximately shoulder height, and that's where they load and unload them. And then in a cool room, the tubs are carried or dragged to the bench, and that's, so there's a lot of kind of double handling, I think we could say here. So in terms of the hazard identification or the problems that were identified here, we weighed all of the tubs. So they weighed anywhere between 15 and 20 kilograms each. We looked at some of the postures. So we were seeing a lot of twisting, bending, reaching to stack those tubs, to drag the tubs, to push them back and forth. And then an extra hazard that was kind of contributing to the lifting and kind of contributing to the postures really, was the leaking of the fluid. So that's almost a safety hazard that was being contributed here as well. It was creating an extra slip hazard. And so some of the solutions that came out of this was that, well, one, a new trolley was developed. So it included a tray, so it was helping to prevent that leak problem. So again, immediately we kind of addressed that safety hazard, and because of that, it made it to be a safer manual lift. As well, the process was changed a little bit so that each full tub was only lifted once onto the table instead of the 3 or 4 times that it was done in the old way, right? So we, again, looked at the process so that, okay, the tubs are heavy, yes, but now we're only lifting them once as opposed to 3 or 4 times. So we've made an improvement there. As well, looking at the postures, they changed it so the tubs were never lifted from the floor, right? So they were at a better height and therefore improved postures. And then ultimately, they found the cost of these trolleys were recovered in about a year because of these improved efficiencies. Again, the eliminating of the double handling and the triple handling was a big efficiency. And then ultimately, they were seeing reduced injury costs as well. Another example, just to kind of show you from a different industry, again, this is just kind of coming up with some ideas again where you're not necessarily needing to use all of those in-depth tools. but this is in a healthcare setting. So the non-nursing workers had some back injuries. They're attributed to pushing, pulling of trolleys or carts, like the linen carts, for example. And so in this case, they measured the force to move the trolleys. They had a force gauge, and they in particular found that pushing the trolley when they were started, when the wheels weren't pointing the right way, that was increased force. Sometimes they were working on carpeted floors. I'm glad healthcare places are getting away from carpeted floors, as well as up ramps over a bump. And so in their solution was, a new fleet of trolleys and more carts. And so there was a lot less force required on these new carts. The handles were at a better height. The wheel diameter was a little bit larger than what the old carts were, and that helped with the resistance and going over the bumps on the floor surface. It actually moved a lot easier. And then as well, the loads in the trolleys were all restrained, which helped to it helped improve the postures, right? They weren't having to bend as much because things were more organized on the shelves. And really, in their case, they were able to reduce some injuries. And so they saw reduced injuries, and they didn't eliminate them completely, but they were able to calculate that it was definitely a big cost saving to them. And just one last example here is that, another company, has kind of obviously changed the names of the company. I don't know, company ABC, but they looked at their back injuries as well as talking with workers. And they thought that one of the major causes of their back injuries was handling bags of cement. And so they knew that smaller and lighter cement bags were available, but they were more expensive. And so that's really, why they were buying these 40-kilogram bags. So you kind of ask the why. It's like, why do they come in 40-kilogram bags? And it's like, well, it's cheaper. And so when they do all the calculations, they thought if they did buy the smaller bags, it was going to cost them a lot of extra money per year, $25,000. However, in this case, because they've had a back injury, they knew what it had cost them, and were able to show that increased cost, buying the smaller bags, was going to save them the cost of at least one workers' compensation claim. And, at the end of the day, for them, it was about measuring employee satisfaction. And that's how, it really helped to know that was a good solution, right? It was worth the extra cost. We had less injuries. Our return on investment was like almost immediate, and we had a lot more employee satisfaction. So I think that went by fast. Hey, it's already almost 10 o'clock. So in terms of risk assessment, it isn't always about, hiring somebody in. Obviously I would love it if you wanted us to help you with your ergonomic issues and, do the risk assessments for you. And we are big on education. We fully realize and know that a lot of this stuff can be done in-house. And there's a lot of things that you can do yourselves, and when you get stuck, you know that you can call us. But in terms of what you can do yourself, it's starting with your MSD hazard checklist. Get yourself, get your team, get your resources trained and up to speed on what those MSD hazards are, and get a process in place. And it doesn't have to be complicated. You start with a checklist, start with a simple one-page form in terms of how you're going to document hazards, and you're brainstorming ideas of how you're going to come up with change to kind of be able to show, if we change this, or we implement this tool, or we change the height of this, that it's going to reduce reaching and it's going to improve the postures. That helps with your justification. So in terms of today, I am all for anytime you guys have a question. I know we have a lot of people who come to our webinars each month. Some of you we do work with, some we don't, and that doesn't really matter. If you have a question and you want to chat about a current problem that you have, you want to talk about how to go through assessing the hazards and prioritizing them, by all means, give me a call or shoot me an email at any time. I'm happy, especially that's kind of my offer for this month, is let's set up a time we can chat. We'll chat over the phone, walk through kind of the problem that you're having, and come up with putting you on the right track into what your next steps are. So you can reach me anytime at info@proergonomics.ca, or my direct email as well, snable@proergonomics.ca, and you can call the main line. as well, anytime. We're happy to answer questions, again, about anything that you have going on. So thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any questions, again, about anything in the webinar content, I have recorded it today, and I will post that on our YouTube channel so that you can log in and listen to that at any time, or share it if you happen to miss it today, or if you know somebody else who would benefit from this. Next month, next month we're talking about office ergonomics. Kind of going to switch gears and talk about office ergonomics. So hopefully you can join us again next month, and I look forward to it. Because we're at 10 o'clock, I'm going to cut off the webinar now, sign off. I do see that a couple of questions have come in, and so I will ensure to respond to you each individually. So I hope that you have a great day today. Thanks so much for joining in, and we will talk to you again soon.